I'm Professor Stephen Coleman, and I've spent many years researching and writing about political communication. I'm interested in how politicians speak to us, how we speak to them, and what we think of each other. In today's episode, we're going to look at political incivility. To help me talk about that, we're going to have as a guest Professor Robert C. Rowland from the University of Kansas.
I'm not going to answer the question because the question is radical left. Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe? In Springfield, they're eating the dogs. The people that came in, they're eating the cats.
This is, I think, one of the reasons why I actually have the endorsement of 200 Republicans.
We did it, Joe. You're going to be the next president of the United States.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
It's all getting very nasty. Politics as unadulterated rage. Election contests as glorified bar brawls. The sound of politics becomes increasingly shouty, angry, resistant towards the slightest difference in perspective.
Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face.
And I would love to be here saying, claiming victory. I would love to be having a front page of the Telegraph with a plane taking off to Rwanda. That's my dream.
The term that is most commonly used to describe this kind of political talk is incivility, referring to the use of rude and disrespectful language, such as name-calling, ridicule, and implicit or explicit incitements to violence, as well as offensively dismissive behaviour, such as interruption, speaking over other voices, hurtful mimicry, or threatening gestures. If asked, few people would say that they like political incivility, that it enriches debate and enlivens democracy. Few people would say, I heard politician X speaking on TV last night. He was really eloquent. He called his opponent a big shitbag and said she ought to be locked up. Few people would say that. But evidence from research suggests that media audiences are often drawn to uncivil political expression, regarding it as simple to grasp and dramatic in its visceral effects. In an age of multi-channel, mainstream media and an almost infinite choice of available social media content, people often flock towards the loudest, pushiest, most provocative messages. But there's a paradox. The more people take in such messages, the less they trust politicians. And the less they trust politicians, the more there is a downstream flow of distrust to the entire political system. Now, this makes sense. When politicians constantly attack their rivals for being idiots, criminals, and losers, onlooking citizens are not only caught up in the rhetorical force of those specific attacks, but conclude that most politicians are idiots, criminals, and losers, operating within a system that seems to be built to accommodate the values of idiots, criminals, and losers. In short, political incivility breeds democratic distrust. Political scientists at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. have been carrying out a series of surveys on how American citizens feel about democracy. The most recent one was conducted earlier this year, 2024. They asked their respondents whether they were happy with the way democracy was working in the United States. Over 2/3 said that they were not happy with the state of US democracy. Is democracy under threat in the United States, was the next question. A staggering 82% said that it was. Now, there are two ways of interpreting these responses. One is to conclude that citizens, at least in the United States, are beginning to give up on democratic politics. They feel so disappointed in the political class, so threatened by what have become routine political strategies of negativity, that they're likely either to withdraw from the whole thing or turn to anti-democratic alternatives. And watching the recent US presidential election, there were surely signs of voters seeking such simplistic, demagogic alternatives. However, there's another way of interpreting those survey findings, which would lead us to the conclusion that if it is to regain public confidence, democracy needs a radical refresh, by which I mean finding creative ways of speaking with confidence about what people want and how those ends can be realised. Rather than there being an endless verbal blame game in which others are attacked as projections of our own failure to build a better society, democracy could focus on the necessary, the desirable, and the achievable. What we need, what we want, and what we can make happen. Now that, I should emphasise, does not mean avoiding or neglecting areas of real disagreement. I would suggest that we have too much of that now, with politicians constantly fighting over the centre ground in order to reach the median voter, which often translates into saying nothing very much to anyone. As we saw in the recent UK election and its aftermath, when there is a failure to highlight real challenges and choices and what needs to be done, or when hard choices are covered up in the hope of seeming to offer everything to everyone, politics fails to address the real interests and values that divide people. It ends up becoming a mere apolitical blur. So making politics less uncivil certainly doesn't mean smothering disagreement. But the choice for democracy need not be between the current permanent psychodrama of hurt feelings and bad faith and the politically anodyne dithering of eternal compromise. Democracy, if it means anything, entails the robust working through of disagreements. We don't necessarily have to like our opponents, or respect their values even, or want to work towards an alliance with them. But neither is democratic politics about crushing opposition, disparaging difference, or winning at all costs. Even when, as seems to be the case right now, such costs amount to a tragedy of the democratic commons, whereby the discursive soil is so toxified by incivility that nothing can grow there anymore. Well, is there a way out of this political nastiness? Should we even bother to hope for something worthier of our human capacity? To help us think about those questions, I'm delighted to have as my guest today Robert C. Rowland, who's Professor of Rhetoric at the University of Kansas, and he's also the author of a fine book that I recommend to you called The Rhetoric of Donald Trump, Nationalist Populism and American Democracy. Let me get to the most sensitive question, in a way, about Donald Trump. He's been described by his opponents as a fascist. I'm not so sure about how we determine whether that's what his ideas are, but in terms of his rhetorical style, his approach to communication, is that an appropriate label, Robert?
In the conclusion of my book, I talked about the various ways that what Trump has done and what he has said and what he would do and what he would say if he were elected president again is a threat to American democracy. And there are a variety of ways that he is a threat. Let me mention a couple of them. First, he divides the nation into his supporters who are, he believes, all good, and then dangerous others. Those are groups that are other than his supporters in the non-college educated, primarily white, primarily religious working class. He characterizes groups such as undocumented immigrants, but at other times, gay Americans, transgender Americans, Islamic Americans, as dangerous in order to create the negative emotion of fear. And over time, that emotion often morphs into hate. So he creates fear and hatred against these dangerous people he depicts as dangerous others. Now, in fact, in all cases when he's talking about Americans, the groups are not more dangerous than just the average American citizen. For example, undocumented immigrants commit fewer crimes per capita than native-born Americans. Transgender Americans, he and his supporters have accused them of various sins, sexual assault. That may happen, but it is vanishingly rare from the research I have done. So one way he's a threat to democracy is by dividing the American people from the perspective of his supporters, the saved and the sinners. Then he does not believe in democratic norms. And he has made that very clear that he will use the instruments of the presidency to go after his enemies. The president is an extremely powerful office, but it has always been constrained by a commitment to democratic norms of the people who held the office. And Trump does not respect those democratic norms, something we saw on January 6, 2021, when he formed a mob and sent them toward the Capitol and then did nothing for several hours as the mob attacked the greatest symbol of American democracy. Now, there are other ways he's a threat to democracy as well, but it seems to me the two I've mentioned are probably the most important threats. Now, political labels about ideology are really, in a way, not appropriate for talking about Donald Trump because he has very few policy commitments. Essentially, what we know in any detail, and we really don't know even details there, is that he doesn't like undocumented immigrants and he would get rid of them if he can, and he supports tariffs.
It seems to me that what you're saying here is that if he's not a fascist, it's only because there's too much incoherence in his ideological position to constitute any kind of ism. But certainly he takes an anti-democratic stance, and that is what you have identified in your book and in the answer that you've just given. So let's talk about American nationalism, Robert. And I am asking this as someone who's not American and who finds it intriguing. First of all, what defines specifically American nationalism, and why is there such a remarkably enthusiastic appetite for it amongst American people?
Actually, I think the authoritarian nationalism in the United States is in some ways similar to other things that are happening in other nations around the world. In my book, I talk about research in social psychology on what's called authoritarian personality structure. An authoritarian personality structure is an extreme discomfort with the pace of social change. People who are set off by the changing demography, by the changing economy of the United States, they react negatively against that. And Trump has tapped into that along with tapping into an anti-elitism. It's not the same anti-elitism as progressives in the United States. People like Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts, it's an anti-elitism about disliking elites because people feel that they're talked down to by elites. And I think in many instances, elites do talk down to ordinary people. And then Trump resolves this by presenting himself initially as the businessman outside hero, and now, frankly, just as a strong man who will protect people. On several occasions, he said explicitly, I will be your protection. But you talk about American nationalism, which in the past has been of an optimistic variant. Whether you go back to FDR or Kennedy, especially Reagan and Obama, had an optimistic retelling of American history in which we were, I'm quoting Reagan now, a nation defined by ideals. And that optimistic variant of American nationalism also had kind of a universal message in that it was believed that the American ideals were really broader than that, were really human ideals. And that's probably expressed most effectively in Ronald Reagan's great speech on June 8th of 1982 in Great Britain in the Royal Gallery at Westminster, or in Obama's great Nobel Prize speech, where he talked about the ideals of democracy. So they, in a way, rechanneled American nationalism and made it about ideals, what Reagan called the shining city on a hill, quoting from a Puritan minister, and what Obama talked about, I might boil it down as audacious hope that all of the citizens of the world might build a better life in which they had a say in their own governance. Trump's the antithesis of that. Trump's drawing on negative emotions. And in that way, I think he was more similar to some of the far right political parties that have had great influence in Germany, France. Brexit is not the same thing. It's not as much a threat to democracy, but as an American, it appears to draw on a similar kind of reaction that there's too much demographic change and we need to return to our point of origin.
I'm wondering, though, Robert, whether the ideal that you've so eloquently summarized is not just an antithesis, but it's also something which, if it cannot be realized as an ideal, can explode or implode into the form of Trumpian nationalism. I wonder whether what we're dealing with in the case of Trump is a disappointment that the American dream is, for many people, unrealizable.
It was driven in part by economic declines for the working class. That's not the cause. People who were most impacted negatively by economic problems in 2016, they voted for Hillary Clinton because she had actual policies that would help them. Yeah. But it certainly creates the sense of the sense of alienation that so many in the white working class feel. So they're clearly an economy that worked better for ordinary people would be a key factor in tamping down the nationalism that I've talked about that's all across the Western society.
Yeah.
But then the other factor, I think, is focusing rather than on our differences as human beings, on our shared identity. It's our ideals that ought to matter more than where we happen to be born or what our gender identity is or any other characteristic. That's a message that requires a great deal of rhetorical skill. It requires someone with the eloquence in America of the two men I mentioned who have dominated American politics for the last almost 50 years before Trump, Reagan and Obama. It's no sin to be not as eloquent as Reagan and Obama, but people like Joe Biden just aren't.
Rhetorically, what characterizes Donald Trump's speaking style? I find that there are certain tropes, this sort of the repetition of the key point at the end of every sentence, sometimes more than once. There seems to be a pattern there. It seems to be a stylistic strategy, but I suspect it's not a strategy at all. What do you think's going on?
Well, I think that's a very smart comment. It's not a strategy, it's just him. I mean, the three themes I've mentioned dominate all his rhetoric. The nationalist theme, the warnings about dangerous others morphing from fear to hatred, the anti-elitism that the elites don't care about you ordinary people, they talk down to you, and then presenting himself as the strongman hero. And what I see over the course of the 8 years, a little bit more than 8 years now since he came down the escalator at Trump Tower, is a move toward more extremism. and it's extreme in terms of his labeling of his opponents. He used to call his opponents the radical left. Now he often uses the word communist, and sometimes he accuses his opponents of both being communist and fascist at the same time, which I think also demonstrates a lack of understanding of what those terms mean. There's more extremism in his negation of his opponents. There's more extremism in his discussion of the American economy is in quite solid shape. And now we have inflation way down, job growth is still going strong, and yet he describes it as if we're in a post-apocalyptic dystopia. And then there is more bragging about what he was doing and what would happen if he were president. He's claimed Hamas would not have attacked Israel last year on October 7th. It is difficult to see why Hamas would have paid any attention to Donald Trump if he had been president. He makes similar outlandish claims about Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And I think you're also onto something in that it's harder to follow the train of his thought. His rally speeches are at least 50% longer than the rallies in 2016. There really weren't rallies in 2020 because of COVID, or as many at least. He refers to the things he talks about as the weave. But I have looked in some detail at his rally speeches, and I do not see any warp and weft to that weave. Right. It seems to be stream of consciousness, anger, grievance, and attacks on his perceived political enemies.
Robert, a personal question. What effect has this had on you? I mean, I've just described how, and maybe with the luxury of not having to live with this person as president, being curiously, maybe sometimes slightly masochistically fascinated by long doses of Trump talk. You have a professional interest in this. You studied it in detail. How does it leave you feeling?
Well, anxiety about the fate of American democracy. And this is not about ideology. I have studied more than anybody else among recent presidents, Barack Obama and Ronald Reagan, and I see the coherence to each of their thought. Yeah. I mean, I have personal views as a citizen, but I think we've often had very effective conservative presidents, and we've had very effective liberal presidents. This is not about party, but it's about a continuation of a commitment to democratic values. And I think the other factor is when you read Trump, he does not make a coherent argument in the way that political leaders of both parties have made them. I've studied all his major presidential speeches, for example, and even the State of the Union addresses didn't make a coherent policy argument. They were stump speeches, rally speeches, altered slightly to meet the genre of a State of the Union. I think, as somebody who studied rhetoric and argument, I think that the genius of the American system is that we argue about it first and then we vote. And hopefully, because of the First Amendment and other forces, by arguing about it first, everybody gets a say, and therefore we hear all the important interests. And the better ideas work themselves out. That's an idea I see in American political philosophy, especially in James Madison and John Stuart Mill in On Liberty, is the great defense of the free marketplace of ideas. And the free marketplace of ideas is certainly undermined when you have rhetoric like that of Donald Trump.
Let me ask you a final question, and let me say these have been such wonderful answers. Let's suppose that the new president were to come to you and say, well, Professor Rowland, you've written a book about my rhetorical style. You seem to know a lot about nationalism. What advice could you give me for making it even more effective during my second administration? How could I tell people what I really think in ways that perhaps will be less offensive to them, but will do the job of getting my ideas across? What, if anything, would you tell him?
I think Donald Trump would be very unlikely to come to me. But let's suppose a conservative president did come to me. I would say that I think that America needs two principled political parties. And we have a principled and pragmatic liberal party, and we need a principled and pragmatic conservative party. And you could have no better role model than to look at the way that Ronald Reagan treated the American people. He treated them as if the American people were serious and they needed to know why he thought that the nation should move in a direction. And so he laid things out in detailed policy speeches. I can tell you as a citizen, I did not mostly agree with President Reagan on domestic policy. Soviet policy is a different thing. But he treated the American people like adults who he should make a case for. And I think it, unfortunately, very unlikely that Donald Trump would ever morph into a president like Ronald Reagan. American politics desperately needs another Ronald Reagan to reform the conservative movement, to present a defense of democracy and a defense of small government, pragmatic governance. In a way, I'm saying we need an American Margaret Thatcher.
That's really interesting, and I really want to thank you for taking the time to speak to me today. So
Thank you for
much.
asking such incredibly smart questions.
His backbenchers say it's embarrassing, your words. Is everything okay, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister! Well, Mr. Speaker, I tell you what's not working, it's that line of attack.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
Hello, it's me again. If you found that episode interesting, you might like to listen to a previous episode. It's the way that they say it, how politicians express themselves, in which I spoke to Professor Rhetoric.
I think of Winston Churchill, who had an extraordinary ability to speak in the most empowering and transcendent terms and voices, especially when the UK was fighting a war. And yet, if you read much about Churchill behind the scenes, he had his eye on the bottom line at all times. Sometimes it wasn't very pretty, the deals that he made, but of course, that's the job of politics. And yet there are other interesting cases. There are some people, President Jimmy Carter had a real ability to speak in a transcendent voice to bring American people together. Donald Trump has no ear for the transcendent, but his emphasis on the pragmatic inspires and brings people together of a certain sort.